I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Take a deep breath and try to recall a very specific smell from your childhood. Perhaps it is the sharp, smoky scent of a honeycomb coal stove burning in a narrow, dimly lit alleyway. Or maybe it is the warm, comforting aroma of coarse grains steaming in a bamboo basket on a freezing winter morning. If you remember these things, you know exactly what era we are traveling back to today. We are returning to the China of the 1970s and early 80s. Today we are going to talk about 25 cheap, humble foods we ate back then, when our pockets were empty, but our homes were full of life. These were the days of ration tickets and extreme scarcity, yet the memories we hold of those meals are incredibly precious. I invite you to sit back, relax, and journey with me. And please stay until the very end, because the final memory we will share is one that perfectly captures a mother's silent, profound love. A memory that might just bring a tear to your eye. Before we delve into our memories, let us set the scene of how life truly felt back then. Time flowed differently in those days. It moved at a much slower, more deliberate pace. There was no rushing, no instant delivery, and absolutely no wasting of what precious little we had. We lived in the era of the planned economy, where almost everything, from cooking oil to grain, required specific ration tickets known as liang piao. Without those tiny, fragile pieces of paper, money alone could not feed your family. Meat was considered a supreme luxury, usually reserved only for the Lunar New Year or a very special celebration. Today there is a modern myth that because we lacked advanced technology and abundant resources, our lives were somehow poorer in every way. But you and I know the truth. Our physical lives may have been simple and demanding, but our emotional lives were incredibly rich. The scarcity of food meant that every single meal was a highly anticipated event. We gathered around small tables, waiting patiently for a simple bowl of hot congee, and in that waiting we found deep human connection. We shared everything. Neighbors helped neighbors, and the honest, sincere conversations we had while preparing those humble ingredients created a profound sense of community that money simply cannot buy today. Let us begin our journey into the past by remembering the humble wotou, or the steamed cornmeal bun. If you grew up in the 1970s, the sight of these golden, cone-shaped buns instantly transports you back to your childhood kitchen. Fine white wheat flour was a rare and precious commodity, strictly rationed and saved only for the most important festivals. Because of this, coarse grains like cornmeal became our daily reality. But you must remember, this was not the sweet, tender, refined cornmeal we can easily find in modern supermarkets. It was rough, dry, and it often scratched the back of your throat as you tried to swallow it. Do you remember how our mothers used to make them? They would mix the coarse yellow powder with water, kneading it firmly with their tired hands, and then skillfully shape the dough into a hollow cone using their thumbs. That hollow center was absolutely crucial, because it allowed the steam to cook the thick bun evenly over the low heat of the coal stove. Eating wotou day after day, month after month, could become incredibly tiresome for a young child. Yet looking back now, there is a profound warmth in that memory. We sat around the table, the steam rising into the cold air, feeling safe and together. Moving from the dry texture of cornmeal, let us remember the endless supply of sweet potatoes. For many families, especially those in the countryside or on the outskirts of the cities, sweet potatoes were the ultimate lifesaver during the long, harsh winters. They were incredibly cheap and grew abundantly. We ate them in every conceivable way. We boiled them into thin, watery congee to stretch our grain rations. We roasted them. But perhaps the most vivid memory is of dried sweet potato slices. In the late autumn, families would cut the massive roots into thin strips or thick slices and lay them out on rooftops, bamboo mats, and courtyard walls to dry in the sun. The entire neighborhood would be covered in a blanket of orange and white. When dried, they became chewy, tough, and intensely sweet, serving as both a staple food and the rare candy for us children. Honestly, there were winters when we ate so much sweet potato that our skin seemed to take on a slight orange tint, and we felt we never wanted to see one again. But today, when you buy a perfectly roasted, incredibly expensive organic sweet potato on a modern city street, does it ever truly taste as sweet as the ones we dried on our roofs? Now let us talk about what was considered the absolute ultimate luxury for a child in those days. A bowl of hot rice mixed with lard and soy sauce. Since meat was practically non-existent in our daily diet, animal fat was incredibly precious. When a family finally managed to buy a small piece of fatty pork with their meat tickets, nothing was wasted. Our mothers would slowly render the white fat in an iron wok until it turned into clear, fragrant oil, leaving behind crispy, golden cracklings that we would beg to eat. The rendered lard was carefully poured into a ceramic jar and kept in a cool place, where it solidified into a snowy white paste. On a very special day, or perhaps when you were feeling a little unwell, your mother might scoop a spoonful of that pure white lard and bury it under a mound of freshly steamed, incredibly hot white rice. You would watch in quiet fascination as the heat melted the fat, turning the rice glossy and translucent. Then she would add just a few precious drops of dark soy sauce. You stirred it all together, and the rich, savory aroma that filled the room was simply intoxicating. It was the most satisfying, decadent meal we could imagine, a true taste of happiness. As the bitter winter approached, a monumental ritual took over the entire country, the storing of the winter cabbage. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rumble of the wooden carts, heavily loaded with thousands of pounds of massive, pale green cabbages. This was not just a shopping trip, it was a matter of survival. Families would buy hundreds of pounds at once. The first task was to dry them. We would line them up along the walls of the alleyways, on balconies, and in the courtyards, letting the crisp autumn wind dry their outer leaves to prevent rotting. Then came the careful stacking in a cool, dark corner, covering them with old quilts to protect them from the freezing frost. For the next 4 or 5 months, cabbage was the absolute center of our universe. We ate it boiled in water, we ate it stir-fried, we ate it stewed with a tiny piece of tofu if we were lucky. The smell of boiling cabbage soup permeated every single hallway of the apartment buildings. We complained about it constantly, wishing for anything else to eat. Yet the security of seeing that massive pile of cabbage slowly shrinking over the winter meant that our family was safe, fed, and enduring the cold together. Because our daily staples of watery congee and coarse grains were so unbelievably bland, we relied heavily on fiercely salty preserved vegetables to give our meals some flavor. This brings us to the pungent, unforgettable world of pickled mustard greens and salted radish strips. When vegetables were plentiful and cheap in the autumn, nothing was allowed to go to waste. Every household had a large, heavy earthenware crock sitting in a dark corner of the kitchen. Our mothers and grandmothers would vigorously rub huge amounts of coarse sea salt into large radishes or mustard greens, packing them tightly into the crock and pressing them down with a heavy, smooth river stone. The fermentation process would take weeks, and a very distinct, sharp, sour smell would fill the air. When we sat down to eat our bowls of plain, thin, sweet potato porridge, a tiny saucer of these crunchy, intensely salty vegetables was placed in the center of the table. You only needed to bite off a tiny piece of the salty radish to flavor 3 huge mouthfuls of plain porridge. It was a masterclass in stretching resources. That sharp, salty crunch is a sound and a sensation that is permanently etched into the memories of our generation. Let us turn our memories to the rare snacks we carried in our pockets, specifically dry roasted soybeans. In an era where beautifully packaged candies and potato chips were the stuff of science fiction, we had to invent our own treats. Soybeans were primarily used for making tofu or extracting oil, but occasionally our mothers would spare a small handful for us. The ritual was incredibly simple but magical. She would heat the heavy iron wok over the glowing coal fire, using absolutely no oil because oil was far too precious. She would toss the hard yellow beans into the dry pan, stirring them constantly with a wooden spatula. Soon a wonderful, nutty, slightly scorched aroma would begin to fill the small kitchen. Then came the sounds, sharp, loud pops as the skins of the beans cracked open from the heat. We would stand on our tiptoes, watching in anticipation. Once they were roasted to a dark golden brown, she would pour them into the pockets of our cotton-padded winter jackets. Not only did they provide a satisfying, crunchy snack that lasted all day at school, but their residual heat also served as a wonderful hand warmer in the freezing weather. It was a double blessing. Another daily reality for many of us was the striking reddish-brown color of sorghum. Sorghum was an incredibly tough, resilient crop that could grow in poor soil, making it a staple in many regions when wheat and rice failed. But as resilient as it was in the field, it was equally tough on the stomach. Eating a bowl of steamed sorghum rice was a true test of endurance. The grains were hard, dry, and had a distinct, slightly bitter, astringent taste that seemed to absorb all the moisture in your mouth. As children, we found it incredibly difficult to swallow, and it often left us feeling bloated and uncomfortable. To make it more palatable, our brilliant mothers would try to mix it with whatever else they could find. Perhaps they would grind it into a fine flour and blend it with a tiny, precious handful of white wheat flour to make a slightly softer pancake or bun. Preparing sorghum required immense physical effort and participation, soaking it, grinding it, steaming it for hours. Today, sorghum is often praised as a healthy, rustic whole grain in expensive restaurants, but for us it will always be the taste of endurance, a symbol of the difficult years we survived together. Amidst the routine of coarse grains and salted vegetables, there were moments of pure, sparkling joy. Think back to the mesmerizing street vendor blowing malt sugar figures. You could always hear him before you saw him. The rhythmic, metallic clang of his small brass gong echoing down the street was a siren call for every child in the neighborhood. We would drop whatever we were doing and sprint toward the sound. The old man carried a wooden cabinet equipped with a small charcoal stove that kept a pot of golden, amber-colored malt sugar warm and pliable. If you were lucky enough to have a few fen, or perhaps some scrap metal or empty toothpaste tubes to trade, you could buy a piece of magic. With a small pinch of the sticky, warm sugar, the vendor would use a tiny hollow reed and his own breath to blow the sugar into incredible shapes, a graceful swan, a fierce dragon, or a simple round balloon. The sugar was slightly smoky, profoundly sweet, and had a sticky texture that would cling to your teeth for hours. We would hold our sugar figures carefully, admiring them for as long as possible, reluctant to take that first, sweet, glass-like bite. For moments of true celebration, there was the unforgettable aroma of sizzling oil and the crunch of a fried dough twist, known as mahua, or the long golden yu tiao. Because cooking oil was strictly rationed to just a few ounces per person per month, deep frying anything at home was an incredibly rare event, perhaps reserved only for a beloved elder's birthday or the Lunar New Year. The preparation itself was a spectacle. The dough was stretched, twisted into intricate braids, and then carefully lowered into a wok of bubbling, hot oil. The loud sizzling sound was like music, and the heavy, rich smell of frying oil would immediately draw neighbors to their windows. The crust turned a beautiful, deep golden brown, becoming impossibly crispy, while the inside remained slightly chewy and dense. When the mahua was finally cool enough to touch, the family would gather around. The mother would break the large twist into smaller pieces, ensuring every child got a fair share. Biting into that rich, oily, crunchy dough was a sensation of pure luxury. We would chew slowly, savoring every single crumb, knowing it might be months before we tasted anything like it again. We must also speak of the pure magic of a perfectly white, fluffy mantou. In today's world, a plain steamed bun is the most basic, inexpensive item you can buy. But in the 1970s, white wheat flour was the undisputed king of grains. For most of the year, our buns were yellow from cornmeal or brown from sorghum. A pure white mantou was a symbol of prosperity and the new year. The process of making them was a sacred ritual. Our mothers would use a piece of old fermented dough called lao mian to leaven the new batch. Because our homes were so freezing cold in the winter, the heavy ceramic basin of dough had to be wrapped in our thickest cotton winter quilts and placed on the warm kang bed to rise overnight. The next day, the kitchen would fill with the intoxicating, slightly sour smell of yeast and the thick, warm steam from the bamboo baskets. When the lid was lifted, revealing those plump, smooth, snowy white buns, our eyes would widen. They were incredibly soft, pillowy, and possessed a gentle, natural sweetness from the wheat that required no sugar at all. Eating a white mantou was a profound comfort, a soft, warm hug in the middle of a harsh winter. Do you remember the sudden heart-stopping sound of an explosion in the alleyway? It was not danger, it was the popcorn man. The street vendor who made puffed rice or popcorn was a traveling magician of our childhood. He would set up his strange blackened iron cannon over a small coal fire. We would bring our own small bowls of precious raw rice or corn kernels, handing them over to be poured into the heavy iron belly of the machine. The old man would seal the lid tightly and slowly turn the handle, the gears grinding as the pressure built inside. We would all stand in a wide circle, fingers shoved tightly into our ears, waiting in thrilling suspense. The vendor would shout a warning, step on the release lever, and with a massive, deafening boom, a huge cloud of sweet white steam would erupt, shooting the puffed grains into a long canvas sack. The smell was absolutely heavenly, a mix of toasted grain and a tiny bit of saccharin he used for sweetness. We would eagerly open our bags, plunging our hands into the warm, incredibly light puffs. And of course, there was always a frantic scramble on the dusty ground to pick up the few stray kernels that had escaped the sack. Frugality was not just a habit in those days. It was an absolute necessity. Nothing demonstrates this better than the way we treated a watermelon. Buying a whole watermelon in the sweltering heat of summer was a monumental treat. The family would gather, the green globe was sliced, and we eagerly ate the crisp, sweet red flesh, letting the sticky juice run down our chins. But the feast did not end there. Throwing away the thick green rinds was considered a terrible waste. Our mothers would take a sharp knife and meticulously peel away the tough, dark green outer skin. What remained was the pale green, firm inner rind. She would slice this into thin, elegant strips. A wok was heated, a drop of oil was added, and the rind was stir-fried quickly with a little garlic, some salt, and perhaps a splash of dark vinegar. The result was astonishing. The watermelon rind transformed into a savory, incredibly crisp vegetable dish that tasted remarkably similar to zucchini or cucumber. It was a free, refreshing side dish that perfectly accompanied our evening congee. It was a testament to the incredible resourcefulness of the women who raised us, turning what others called garbage into a delicious meal. If there was one food that was universally considered a miracle cure for any childhood illness, it was canned fruit in heavy syrup. In a time when fresh fruits like peaches, pears, and mandarin oranges were strictly seasonal and hard to transport, a glass jar of canned fruit was a treasured item. It was extremely expensive, and usually only given as a formal gift when visiting a sick relative or during major holidays. The jars themselves were beautiful, heavy glass, displaying the perfectly peeled golden halves of peaches swimming in a thick, clear liquid. If you caught a bad fever, your mother might finally open that jar sitting on the highest shelf. The metallic pop of the tin lid was the sound of relief. The fruit was incredibly soft, practically melting in your mouth, but the best part was always the syrup. It was intensely sweet, cool, and soothing to a sore throat. We would tilt the jar back, ensuring we drank every last precious drop of that sugary liquid. And once the jar was empty, it was never thrown away. It was meticulously washed and repurposed as a tea mug for our fathers, a permanent reminder of a rare and sweet luxury. Let us reflect on the profound importance of bone broth. Because lean meat was so expensive and heavily rationed, families often requested the cheapest cuts available when it was their turn at the butcher block. This usually meant large, bare pork bones with only the tiniest scraps of meat or fat clinging to them. But in the hands of our mothers, those bones were culinary gold. The ritual would begin early in the morning. The bones were washed and placed into a large aluminum pot on the coal stove. They would simmer there for hours, sometimes entirely through the day and into the night. Slowly the water would transform, turning from clear to a rich, cloudy, milky white, as the marrow and cartilage melted into the broth. The heavy, comforting aroma of pork fat would fill the entire house, masking the smell of the coal. When dinner was served, the broth was used as a luxurious base for our noodles or cabbage. But the true prize was the bone itself. It was passed around the table, and we would eagerly use our chopsticks to dig out the soft, jelly-like marrow from the center, sucking on the porous bone until all the flavor was entirely gone. When time was short, or when the pantry was completely bare of vegetables, our mothers turned to a dish of unparalleled simplicity and explosive flavor: scallion oil noodles. It required only 3 basic ingredients: dried wheat noodles, green scallions, and oil. The magic lay entirely in the execution. A bowl of freshly boiled plain white noodles was prepared. On top, a generous handful of finely chopped bright green scallions was placed, along with a pinch of salt and a splash of soy sauce. The crucial moment came next. A large spoonful of oil was heated in a small iron ladle directly over the open flame of the coal stove, until it was practically smoking. With a swift motion, the mother would pour the blazing hot oil directly over the scallions. The sharp, violent, sizzling sound was incredibly satisfying. Instantly, the intense heat released the deeply fragrant, slightly sweet aroma of the scallions, filling the kitchen with an unbelievable scent. You mixed the warm, oily noodles quickly with your chopsticks, coating every strand in that savory, aromatic oil. It was humble, cheap, and yet deeply satisfying, a true masterpiece of our childhood kitchens. As the harsh winter winds howled outside, the honeycomb coal stove in the center of the room was our only source of warmth. And it was also the source of one of our most beloved winter treats: roasted sweet potatoes buried in the ashes. In the late evening, when the cooking was finished and the coal fire was beginning to die down to a soft, glowing red ember, our parents would take small, slender, sweet potatoes and nestle them deep into the hot gray ashes at the base of the stove. We would go to sleep with the faint, earthy smell of the potatoes slowly baking. In the morning, or perhaps as a late-night snack, they would be carefully pulled out with a pair of long iron tongs. The outer skin would be entirely blackened, charred, and brittle. But as you cracked it open, a cloud of hot, sweet steam would escape. The flesh inside was incredibly soft, almost like a pudding, and the natural sugars had caramelized against the skin, creating a sticky, dark syrup. We would toss the searing hot potato from hand to warm our frozen fingers, before devouring the incredibly sweet, smoky flesh, leaving us with satisfied smiles and faces smeared with black ash. In our relentless pursuit to ensure no calorie was ever wasted, we must remember the dry, humble taste of tofu residue, widely known as okara or duja. When a family went through the laborious process of grinding soaked soybeans to make fresh soy milk or tofu, the liquid was pressed through a cloth, leaving behind a large mound of pale, crumbly soybean pulp. Today this byproduct is often thrown away or fed to livestock. But in the 1970s, it was an essential source of protein and bulk for our meals. By itself, duja was incredibly dry, flavorless, and had a slightly grainy, chalky texture that was hard to swallow. To make it edible, our mothers would heat a wok, add a tiny bit of precious oil, and stir-fry the pulp with generous amounts of chopped green onions, coarse salt, and maybe a little preserved radish for flavor. The heat would toast the pulp slightly, giving it a comforting, nutty aroma. We would mix it into our rice or congee. It was a rough food, a food born entirely of necessity and poverty, yet it represents the profound resilience of a generation that learned to survive and thrive on what others discarded. Winter brought another vivid memory, the bright sparkling red of hawthorn berries coated in sugar, the legendary tang hulu. In the drab grey landscape of a northern winter, the sight of the tang hulu vendor carrying his large straw pole pierced with dozens of these sweet skewers was a burst of vibrant color. Hawthorn berries are incredibly sour, almost inedible on their own, but when threaded onto a long bamboo stick and carefully dipped into a pot of molten rock sugar, they transformed into something magical. The freezing winter air would instantly harden the sugar into a delicate, glass-like shell. Buying one was a rare treat, often a reward for good grades or a special holiday outing. The experience of eating it was a beautiful contrast. First, the satisfying crack of the hard, sweet sugar shell against your teeth, followed immediately by the sharp, intense, juicy sourness of the soft berry inside. The combination of sweet and sour, hard and soft, cold and sticky, was absolutely perfect. We would walk down the snowy streets, holding our tang hulu like precious rubies, savoring each berry slowly to make the joy last just a little bit longer. When the long, brutal winter finally broke and the first signs of spring appeared, a new ritual began, the foraging of wild greens, particularly shepherd's purse or hikai. Before the planted crops were ready to harvest, the fields, riverbanks, and city outskirts offered a free bounty. Grandmothers and young children would take small woven baskets and small iron trowels, spending hours bent over the damp earth, carefully digging up the tender young rosettes of wild greens. It was a communal activity, filled with chatter and the fresh, clean smell of thawing soil. We would bring baskets of these jagged little leaves home, where they had to be meticulously washed to remove the grit. If the family was incredibly lucky and had a tiny bit of pork fat or some dried shrimp, the chopped wild greens would be mixed into a filling for spring dumplings. Biting into a hikai dumpling was like tasting the essence of spring itself. The flavor was uniquely earthy, slightly grassy, and wonderfully fresh. It was a wild food, a gift from nature that provided essential vitamins and a desperately needed change of flavor after months of eating nothing but stored winter cabbage. Finally, we come to the memory I promised you at the beginning, a memory of profound love found in the burnt bottom of an iron wok. I'm talking about guoba, the scorched rice crust. In our homes, rice was cooked in a large, heavy cast-iron wok over a coal fire. It was incredibly difficult to control the heat perfectly. Inevitably, the bottom layer of rice would burn slightly, fusing into a hard, golden-brown crust clinging to the iron. When the soft, fluffy white rice was scooped out to serve the adults and the older siblings, the mother would carefully use a heavy metal spatula to scrape the guoba from the bottom. It was hard, dangerously crunchy, and tasted strongly of toasted, almost burnt grain. Yet our mothers would save these broken, scorched pieces and hand them to us children as if they were precious biscuits. Sometimes we ate it dry, our jaws working hard to break it down. Other times, she would pour a little hot water or thin vegetable broth over it, making it sizzle and soften. Looking back, we realized she gave us the guoba not just as a snack, but to ensure she could leave the soft, easily digestible rice for the elders, quietly filling her own stomach with the scraps. It was the taste of maternal sacrifice. As we reach the end of our journey, a quiet truth settles in our hearts. When we look back at the rough cornmeal, the endless cabbage, and the burnt rice crusts, we realize that we are not truly missing the taste of poverty or the physical hunger. What we are mourning is the passing of our youth. We are longing for that unparalleled feeling of togetherness, the way a single piece of fried dough could bring an entire family joy, and the undeniable reality that when we had nothing, we had each other. The food was undeniably cheap, but the love, the resilience, and the sense of community were richer than anything money can buy today. What about you? Which of these foods instantly brings you back to your mother's kitchen? Please share your most cherished childhood food memories in the comments below, because your stories keep these beautiful moments alive. If you found a piece of your own past in this video, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Let us continue to remember and honor the beautiful, resilient history we all share.